Hello, this is the beginning of a sequence that's going to talk about project planning and project management for research. There are multiple skills that are useful across many disciplines and honestly outside of research in the classroom. Skills such as taking effective notes, doing a literature review, managing your citations, etc. are skills that are useful across disciplines but not necessarily the purview of any one discipline, and this is when workshops can be useful. Project planning is basically useful anytime you're doing work that has some sort of deadline, that is beholden to others' expectations in some way, which is true basically for any paper or any sort of collaborative project you might do for research. That's what this sequence is for, to talk about this broadly useful skill that is project planning and project management. These are learnable skills, however, like any skill, it requires practice. So if that sounds good to you, let's continue. This presentation is being given by Sarah Sage, who is a project manager in the Office of the Provost.
I have experience delivering large-scale IT projects and managing strategic initiatives led by university administration, faculty, and staff. And Rafia Mirza, who is the Digital Scholarship Librarian at SMU Libraries.
My project management experience has primarily been around collaborative projects in the digital humanities. In this video, we will discuss principles of project planning and project management as applied to research projects. Thinking about these as skills that you can learn and get better at with practice will be helpful in your academic career. The concepts and practices we'll talk about today will be focused on research projects, but can also easily apply to projects in the workplace as well. The recurring themes of this workshop are that all projects require timelines, rely on clear communication, and being explicit about commitments.
Your takeaways will include basic concepts of when and why project management is needed, and how to use the concept of agility to help deliver your research project.
So first of all, when we talk about projects, project planning, project management, what do we mean by that? What is a project? A project has a specific defined goal. A project ends, and because it has an ending, you can define success by imagining what a successful completed project would be and then working backwards to list out the steps you would need to do to get to that ending. What is project planning? Project planning is focused on what it is you want to do. You're defining what your goals are through a scope statement. Think about a thesis statement. A thesis statement is a kind of scope statement when you define the goals of your paper. What is project management? Project management is how you are working through your plan to complete your project. So in this process, you define your goal in your scope statement and then map it out in a project plan. Once you start working on the project, you are managing your process to complete that project. Part of that process might be adjusting your scope statement or your goals as you start to do the work, the same way you might adjust a thesis statement. You're still working towards some kind of specific defined end goal with intentionality even as you adjust your plans.
This part will tie into how we'll talk about agility and how agile projects reach their goals more quickly and often in a more collaborative and reliable way.
So in the previous example of a research paper or article, project planning is what you think about what you might need to do to write that article. Do you need to go to an archive? Do you need to read certain texts? Think about what labor you might need to engage in and what your timeline is. Project management is when you start doing your research work and you realize, oh, I actually need to go to this archive because the texts I need aren't digitized, but maybe I can contact them and have them scan a copy. Or these articles have to come through interlibrary loan and I need to allow time for that. As you adjust your expectations or timelines to account for these realizations as you work, that's project management. Project plans are important to make sure everyone is working towards the same goal and to ensure all participants' definitions of success and completion are the same. You might be starting work on a research project and your goal is to successfully complete it, but what does that mean? Collaboration is not just asking people how they will do the work of your project, but asking how best they think they could contribute to the goal, or if they have suggestions based on their expertise, and then listening to what they say. Ideally, you'll incorporate their feedback before you start and shape the scope together so that it is achievable.
And the achievability of your goals can change throughout the life of a project. How can we reconcile the definition of done with fast, dynamic research projects? We'll try to help you answer this question.
We want to establish why it is important to think of research projects as projects. We argue that good, or shall we say effective, projects begin with a plan. It's true those plans may change over the life cycle of the project, your questions may change, your funding may change, even the shape of your final research project may change. But it is still a project, and what separates projects that turn into something from those that stall and go nowhere is the formulation of a reasonable, informed, and purposeful plan.
And how we can adapt to change through iterative planning.
There's a maxim that a project can be two of the three following things, but not all three: fast, cheap, or good. You need both a long-term view of your project as well as a short-term view. Good project planning helps you keep these views in balance. Remember your goal and account for the time, labor or expertise, and money you have available for your project. Again, in academia, you have multiple projects going on at the same time. You might need to balance different goals during a semester. You have a couple of different classes each semester. You may also have a goal of acquiring specific skills such as reading in another language or gaining some sort of computational skill. You need to balance all of these projects while you work towards your degree.
This is the iron triangle of project management, and it represents the three project constraints you balance to achieve success.
Put another way, think about when you're first choosing the topic of a paper. Often, especially when starting out in a discipline, you might write a scope that is too expansive for the amount of time you have to spend on it. As you gain experience or plan out the research process, you may scale your scope back or adjust your timeline.
Often in agile projects, the cost is fixed and the effort is time-boxed. That is, deadlines don't move. You achieve whatever you achieve in the given time period. Scope can change and should change to maintain the quality of your project. You will incorporate improvements as you learn along the way. If you want a project, you want a scope. So one thing that we would argue is that a successful project must have a scope statement. The scope statement defines the project goals and the project's deliverables.
Scoping is the process of writing down your end goal, the work, also called deliverables, that need to happen for your end goal to be achieved. You might find it helpful to think about what does done look like and then working backwards from that. So, what are the boundaries of the project? How long does the paper need to be? What are your expected outcomes? What is your timeline? Do you have any constraints? These might be time constraints. Do you have other papers due that semester? There might be resource constraints. There might be technical constraints. There might be skill constraints. For resource constraints, maybe some of the primary sources you're interested in have not been digitized, and they're in an archive you can't get to that semester. There might be technical constraints if you need specialized technology or software. There might be skill constraints. Maybe the primary resources are in a language you don't have reading proficiency in, so you might need to either gain proficiency or look into getting a translation. Maybe as you're looking at your research, you'll see that people are mentioning text mining methodologies that you're not necessarily familiar with. So you would need to either determine if you would want to become familiar with those or consider other analytic methods. I also find it helpful while writing a scope statement to also write down what is out of scope. If you're prone to getting distracted or going off on tangents, it's good to write down an out of scope statement, also known as exclusions, that you can refer to throughout your process. In this post, Owens writes that research questions provide a constant point of reference to check back on when working on a project. You write down your questions as you go, and you can always pull them out again and check to see if, in fact, you are actually working to answer them or if you have drifted off to some other problem. The purpose of research questions is to clarify what is in and out of scope in a project, to define where a project should start and end. You document your research questions and your challenges so you can refer back to them and see, oh, I'm still on scope, or no, I'm off scope and I need to get back on scope, or I'm off scope, but I actually want to focus on this instead, so I'm going to change my project plan to reflect this new goal. I may need to adjust my timeline to account for this. If you can't adjust your timeline because semesters have a specific start and end time, do you put this new topic on a future to-do list, or do you stick with it and ask for an extension? Referring back to your scope is especially important when you are starting multiple projects or projects that require new skills.
Are you on a project where you are doing all of the work?
If so, how are you going to manage your commitments and other expectations? In a project where you're working solo, where you're doing all the labor, your project likely still has stakeholders who care about your outcomes. If you're working on a research project or paper in a field that emphasizes solo authorship, You are the person doing all the work, but you're doing that work for someone. Who are you doing that work for? Who is your audience? Is it for a lone faculty member? Is it for a committee? Are you responding to a CFP or call for papers for a conference or a journal?
If there are people who determine if your project is a success or failure, they are your stakeholders.
These individuals must be involved in planning activities. Getting feedback on your goals before you begin doing the work is helpful because if there's any implicit expectations or mismatched expectations, finding those out before you start is much better than finding them out after you've done all the work. So for a CFP, you would look at the call. If it's very clear about expectations, you continue on, or you might have questions, and you would want to ask those before submitting. Project management for solo projects is about time management and stakeholder management. What commitments have you made? Did you document them? Did you communicate them? When working on any project, including research projects, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Who are the stakeholders and who is setting the deadlines? When we use the term stakeholder, we just mean anyone who's invested in the outcome. Anyone you're doing the project for is a stakeholder. Generally, in a research project, part of the reason you're doing it is to advance your knowledge or your skill, so you would be a stakeholder. If you're writing a research paper for a class, the professor is also a stakeholder. If you're writing a dissertation, the dissertation committee members are stakeholders. What do we mean by stakeholder management?
By stakeholder management, we mean how do you manage the individuals who define your success?
Basically, what are the stakeholder expectations? For example, in a class, the instructor is a stakeholder, and they will communicate some of their expectations in the syllabus. When are the due dates? What kind of citation style are you meant to use? And so on. If you have any questions about expectations laid out in the syllabus for a specific assignment, you'll want to make sure to reach out to your professor before the due date. For every project, especially when you're in school, you have a finite amount of time. You want to make sure you account for how much time of yours and your stakeholder you can spend on this project. If you have multiple papers due in a semester, you have multiple projects for which you will also want to make sure you're managing the time of your stakeholders. For example, if you're working on your dissertation and you're meeting with one of your committee members for feedback, you'll want to send them a draft with sufficient time for them to read it before the meeting. How much time is sufficient time? If they have not told you, it's better to ask what their preference is rather than guessing. Planning process. How the planning process is critical to reaching your project goals. So we would argue that communication is one of the most important parts of project management. Do you clearly understand what commitments you have made to others, and have you clearly communicated what your commitments are to others?
You also need commitment from others. How can we ensure everyone is committed to an achievable goal? Which brings us to the next topic.
Let's talk about documentation. As you're mapping out what your project is, your scope and your timeline, are there any changes that are occurring? You need to communicate those changes to others to make sure that everyone is clear on those, especially when you're coordinating group work. Memory is fallible. Not everyone will remember everything the same way. Once you've had conversations about expectations, write those down and share them with your stakeholders and or group members as appropriate. Write down and communicate expectations, timelines, expected labor, so you and or your group can refer to them. You can adapt and change them as circumstances dictate. Gallagher discusses how a commenter on her post about managing deadlines in grad school noted that her description for managing project deadlines was similar to the basic principles of project management. It had her thinking that she should look more into this, but never did. Then she started to organize her thesis projects, and all she could think was, you know what I wish I knew more about? Project management. Managing project deadlines for grad school is project management. It's important to brainstorm your tasks early on, to roughly plan out the order of your tasks so you can budget a realistic amount of time, and decide on your priorities. You may have started to do project management in an ad hoc manner, using a journal, using a calendar, but being explicit and intentional about these processes can be incredibly helpful, especially when you are communicating to others. As I mentioned earlier, some of this just requires practice and experience. It's hard the first time you do something to know how much time it will take. So your first semester of graduate school or your first project, you might be off on time estimations, but as you take notes, you'll be able to see where you did not allow enough time and then adjust timelines in the future for future projects. In this example, you can see a very explicit example of approaching a dissertation as a project. listing out who are the stakeholders, who you're doing the work for, what does the project and topic require in terms of tasks, in terms of timeline, what are some challenges or risks that might come up, how are you going to manage and communicate challenges or risks, how then do I complete this project?
There are many different conceptual models used for project planning, but we're only going to talk about a couple. Different models are good for different kinds of projects. We want you to think about your options and choose a working style that meets your needs.
Waterfall tends to be linear and has more of a set path. It doesn't allow for much deviation or the incorporation of feedback. If you thought project management was not for you, it might be you were thinking of a conceptual model or style like Waterfall that didn't accommodate incorporating feedback and adjustment. There are conceptual models like Agile that are more iterative and focused on continuous outputs that allow you to incorporate feedback. So for example, if you're planning out your dissertation, a waterfall sequence would focus more on planning out your dissertation as a whole, continuing to the end, and not incorporating too much feedback. Agile would be more focused on phases, getting more feedback on the individual chapters. Agile allows you to adjust what you're working on before the end, rather than waiting till the end.
Research projects often utilize adaptive planning. Agile planning doesn't happen just once. It happens many times over the life of a project. Most folks are really bad at long-term planning and estimating achievable work on 1, 2, and 3-year plans. This includes me. Agile planning tries to address this problem.
The utility of the planning process is that it helps you break things down into steps rather than large amorphous goals. A useful framework allows you to break down your project into steps, and then once you've broken down your project into steps or phases, you can then start to sequence and consider what needs to be done in order for you to achieve that goal. The most important takeaway is being explicit about your process, needs, and why you are doing the tasks you are doing in the sequence you are doing them.
Planning should be iterative. Choose multiple phases for long projects, perhaps greater than 3 months. Think small. Improve your outcomes by setting quick, achievable goals. The idea of working on 2 chapters in a semester is more achievable and specific than just saying, I will work on my dissertation and it will be done in 2 years. You may have heard the phrase, fail fast. For research, we would say that means you want to find dead ends as soon as possible and avoid sunk costs.
So when you're writing a chapter, when drafting and researching, you might realize what I thought was going to be in this archive is different than what I thought. What data I thought might be freely available is not freely available. Or the digital humanities project I want to do is not possible within the time frame of 1 semester. You can just adapt and adjust your plans. Many grants require pilot projects for this reason, so that they can see you have thought about and can adjust to challenges.
We want to discuss the importance of a scope statement. Decide what you are doing and then define the why. Work should not begin until the scope is reviewed and approved by key stakeholders. The more time and labor goes into a project, the more important it is to figure out what everyone is doing before you begin.
Write down the answers to the following questions. Why? Why are you doing this project? For example, I am completing a dissertation to fulfill the requirements of my PhD program. PhD program may have additional specific requirements for dissertation that you need to remember. All chapters must be previously unpublished, you must incorporate a specific citation style, etc. In terms of your topic, you might be addressing a new concept in your field. You might be expanding or disagreeing with an established concept. So not only addressing the practical aspect of I'm doing a dissertation because my PhD requires it, why are you doing it in relation to your field? What do we need to do? For example, the goal of this project is to have a completed dissertation consisting of there's a minimum word count, a minimum chapter count, a minimum level of engagement with specific methodologies or scholars in your field. Write that down. When does this project need to be finished by? For example, this project needs to be done specific numbers of years from now. Maybe by the time my funding runs out, it might be specified in your package. I will spend 2 years working on this dissertation, but in order to start working on it at a specific time, I will have needed to complete a certain number of classes, acquired specific language or technical skills, etc. How? How are you going to do it? This project is going to engage with, state your idea, The introduction will be an overview of topics A, B, and C. Chapter 1 is going to address this specific topic. Chapter 2 will address different specific topic. So in this example, we're sort of doing a waterfall approach where we're planning out the entire dissertation in regards to what is required. This might be a useful documentation to make even if you are using agile processes. For each individual chapter, you would want to break down your ideas further using an agile or iterative method for each chapter, and then break down what you're doing in the course of 3 months.
Last but not least, who? Who are the stakeholders and how updated do you need to keep them? For a dissertation, it is yourself, it is your advisor, your committee members, your department at a minimum. A scope statement is critical for negotiating the work with other parties and features the following sections: purpose, key deliverables, exclusions, milestones, communication needs, acceptance criteria, team members, and team approval. Your deliverables and outcomes can be written for agility. Think small, deliver fast.
So in a group project for a class, you might start working on your scope statement based on the assignment listed in your syllabus. This will give you the purpose and the key deliverables. Decide as a group what's required and what's not needed. Milestones would be if you need to turn in drafts or prototypes. What are the communication needs of your group? Do you use email, text? How do you agree upon needs to be done for different tasks that the group will be doing? Determine which team member will be doing what, and how do you determine if the group is happy with the project and when it's ready to turn in? So a scope statement would help you define what the key components of your project are, what you're trying to do, what is the purpose, what is it that you need to do, what is out of scope, what are you not doing, what are milestones or things that if you haven't done maybe by a certain point will cause you to reassess what your goal is, allowing you to monitor and adjust your goals if you haven't achieved a certain milestone. Who needs to know what is happening? How do you know when your project is complete? If there are any team members or anyone who needs to have final approval of the project. Begin by thinking about the end. What does done look like? Again, backwards planning can be very helpful. Writing out your goal is critical to project planning, especially when you're asking others for help. Timelines. A roadmap is basically how you see your work progressing. And part of this process of communication and documentation is for yourself as well. You can have scope creep or you can have issues where the project no longer aligns with your goals. So you want to make sure you're constantly checking in with yourself that what you're doing still serves your purpose. Sometimes a project can get away from you, as in the slide, and the goal of the project merely becomes to complete the project because it's a project that you need to complete and it no longer actually serves a useful purpose. As Martin states in his experience with some grad students, the project ends up having some sort of Frankenstein quality to it. It has its own needs, its own demands, and usually those demands interfere with what graduate studies should accomplish, learning new things and becoming a better researcher and scholar.
In general, planning tools often have some sort of visual component and some sort of calendaring component to help you lay out in sequence the steps you need to take.
Sequencing comes up a lot in projects. When you get started, you might not think things need to happen in a certain sequence. But then you start working and you realize we can't actually do this part of the project until we've completed these other parts. Or I need to gain certain skills before I can do this. Or I realize these skills don't actually get me what I want, so I'm going to change the topic of a particular chapter.
It is often helpful if you use visual tools to plan work. There's different ways to do this. Some people use index cards, post-it notes, online planning tools, calendars, or really anything that helps you simplify or break down complex tasks into sequence tasks. You don't need fancy software to get started managing the work. Using card walls helps you simplify complex tasks and helps you visualize sequencing. This is a more complex template that can be built in a spreadsheet. This is a project roadmap. You can adjust the time boxes or sprints based on your schedule. We're showing 3 months of work, given that's the sort of natural breakdown that a semester gives you on campus. So given you want to accomplish by the end of the semester, what are the outcomes that you need to have completed to achieve these goals. I want to write X number of words each month, so I'm going to do research on week 1, I'm going to read and synthesize the notes on week 2 and 3, and I'm going to write on week 4. I suggest building your scope statement with stakeholders first, and then translate that information into a project roadmap.
This is an example of a project roadmap template with some deliverables and outcomes filled in. It can also help with time management if you break down your time into units, especially if you have multiple projects. This way you can see if you've made too many things due the same week, or if it conflicts with other commitments or vacation, etc. Additionally, as you write out dates, it helps clarify in your mind that certain deliverables and outcomes need to happen before others. Making things stackable and modular means that you're actually completing an outcome throughout your sprint, and even if you fall short and don't finish all of your outcomes, you've likely completed some. Each sprint is roughly a month, so as the semester goes on, if you have to adjust your roadmap, you can adjust throughout the semester rather than getting to the end of the semester and not realizing you have not completed any of your goals. So as you're building your plan, you'll want to build in whatever works for accountability for you. So if you're a person who needs weekly check-ins, can you find a writing partner, a dissertation writing group? If you want to plan to go to office hours or meet with your chair at least twice a semester, you can plan to do that. Group projects, collaborating with others. How are you managing people's expectations and commitments? Does everyone agree upon and have a common understanding of goals, of the timeline, of the amount of labor each person is doing?
Collaborative project efforts have been some of the most rewarding and harrowing experiences of my career, even before I became a project manager.
So let's take a moment and think about group research projects you worked on in the past. Think of some challenges you run into. How many of those issues really came down to differing expectations and communication issues? Challenges in group projects usually revolve around authority or responsibility. So in a group project, who is the point person? How are decisions made? In a project, you may have a formal structure with explicit authority, so those lines are made clear, but often you'll have informal structures with implied responsibility. It's rare to have authority over others in a team in higher education and many other organizations. To be successful, a team needs to discuss who is the point person, who is making decisions, how are decisions being made, who's setting agendas, who's responsible for facilitating meetings, who's taking meeting notes, who is deciding on action items, who is tracking progress towards goals. Without intentionality, you can easily end up working at cross purposes, engaging in scope creep where the project goals keep getting bigger and bigger without explicit discussion or adjustment of labor or timelines. Communication and documentation. Again, we want to reiterate documentation in service of clear communication of expectations, and these are incredibly important for group projects. No one's memory is as good as they think it is. Put it in writing. The more partners in a project, the more you need to memorialize any agreements. It isn't that people are mean or malicious, it's just that we are all busy academics. Often we forget our agreements and thus end up not delivering on them.
I have a motto that I share with my teams. If it can't be documented, then it can't be done by others. Project documentation should be collaborative and help clarify the work. It allows everyone on your team, including stakeholders, to share an understanding of your common goals.
But more importantly, these documentation tools make sure you have discussions about how much effort something will take before you begin. This is an incredibly important and useful part of working through creating this kind of documentation. A lot of times for a project, especially when it's involving a type of work you haven't done before or where you're relying on a partner to do the work, you want to make sure you have an accurate understanding of how much labor you're asking for and how much time it will take. Sometimes people will create a project plan, and if they haven't talked to people who have experience in that type of work, they are likely to underestimate how much time something can take. It can also lead to poor sequencing of tasks, of inaccurate estimates of cost or time. Again, documentation isn't very useful if it isn't created in agreement with the people doing the work and easily accessible to others in a shared location.
If the work isn't understood well enough to create a scope statement with the team, it's helpful to start with a project charter first.
A charter is a lightweight tool for project planning. It guides you through an important series of conversations about what exactly you're doing and when you're doing it. It functions as a set of guideposts to keep you on the path to completing your project. As projects get bigger and involve more money, labor, and time, you may want something more explicit like an MOU or a Memorandum of Understanding. But equally important, these tools all make sure you have discussions about how much effort something will take before you begin.
These tools help you negotiate work between different parties and build an understanding of the project's value.
For digital scholarship or digital humanities projects, you'll often see resources such as project charters, MOUs, toolkits, project closeout documentation, project preservation requirements, etc. Again, getting started, you can use a lightweight tool like a charter. It's very useful. It's part of getting feedback from people on campus with domain knowledge or experience in these types of projects. They can tell you what you need to focus on while getting started and what is not necessary for your initial project.
Collaboration is a process, and the scope statement is your foundation for your work. If this document is not collaborative or not achievable from the team's point of view, the preceding steps will most likely not help much either. But having agreed upon a high-level scope statement helps you generate a detailed project roadmap. Team meetings and team check-ins can also make sure that you're sticking to your scope statement and allow you to adjust the project roadmap as needed. The roadmap is a living document. The scope statement is not. The scope statement is first and foremost a collaborative document. I follow a very basic template as a guide and facilitate the conversation for the team to build it. You will be surprised how effective this simple tool is for aligning diverse individuals and interests into a common understanding of the work.
When you actually write down what you're discussing, you'll notice if there's areas where there's miscommunication or disagreements. When working on a scope statement, you want to meet with everyone on the team so you can receive feedback as it's being built.
We recommend at least 1 hour for the scope discussion. When you build this document together, and yes, this involves one person typing in front of everyone else, which may take some courage, it reduces the time spent going back and forth over multiple rounds of edits. As we've mentioned, the scope statement is the starting point and foundation of all the other steps. Without it, the other tools will not be very effective. As we've mentioned, the scope statement is the starting point and foundation for all the other steps. Without it, the other tools will not be very effective. These skills are desperately needed on teams, often with no one to do them. When you help facilitate project management for your team, it is an example of servant leadership. Much like the captain of a soccer team, you still play in the game, but you do a bit of extra work too.
This is true whether it's a formal structure with explicit authority, such as in a traditional workplace where someone is the supervisor. They are more likely to take on the leadership position, but you still want to get feedback from the people who are doing the work. They'll have the expertise, they'll know about possible challenges. In academia and a lot of the projects that you might work on with digital scholarship or across departments, you end up working in an informal structure with implied responsibility, or you're asking people if they want to partner with you. In that case, it's even more important to discuss and have conversations about who's doing what, especially if you want to partner with these people in the future. Going back to our example of a challenging group project in class, there are people you might avoid doing work with in the future, so it's important to make sure everyone has the same expectations about how much work is expected of them before you begin. Again, if you haven't had that conversation before getting started, you might not know how much work you're asking someone to do.
The project roadmap is the collaborative agreement of how much time everything will take and who will be spending their time on different tasks. The team meetings are where you can discuss or adjust the roadmap as needed. This is a critical tool for your team members to be self-organized, so you don't need to send them constant reminders about what is due and when it's needed.
Separation of tasks is when you want to have people commit to specific tasks. I can think of group projects where we didn't discuss the separation of tasks and who would be doing what, and so we ended up with multiple people doing the same task and then certain tasks going undone because we were not explicit about who was doing what. Collaboration is facilitated by whoever the formal or informal project manager is. Again, think about group projects where no one explicitly was in charge of scheduling meetings as opposed to ones where you had explicit discussions about who is doing what and who is scheduling. Another reason that's good to explicitly discuss who is doing what is to avoid having a few group members do the majority of the work while others do less. The roadmap is basically how you see your work progressing. For example, I want to write X number of words each month, so I'm going to do research on week 1, I'm going to read and synthesize notes on week 2, I'm going to try and write this many words on the 4th week of the month.
I use the project roadmap as the agenda for all of my team meetings so that everyone knows what will be discussed and it's expected to deliver the next time we meet. Since this is a living document, we update each week to keep it relevant and keep us on track.
You want to check in, even if it's only with yourself. If you're writing a dissertation chapter, you just want to periodically check, am I on track? Do I need to adjust anything on my timeline? Am I even still interested in this topic? If you're working with others, it's very important to check how everyone is doing with their commitments and if you need to adjust any dates. During team meetings, you can adjust who's doing what or timelines based on any challenges you've run into. Even if it's solo work, you might still have meetings. You meet with your dissertation chair, and if you run into any challenges, you might need to follow up or schedule an additional meeting. You want to make sure you're communicating any challenges you're running into or any changes that you're making.
If you're having team meetings, you should be doing check-ins and asking, is this roadmap still working? Does anything need to change? In the workplace or for grant work, conference planning, a large digital scholarship project, etc., you might need to meet relatively frequently. But again, it depends on the project and team. You can leverage your roadmap as a key part of stakeholder engagement. It can be the single pane of glass for the health of your project. As the work progresses, it is easy to evaluate if your project is lacking enough resources or people to make the work happen.
And just a little aside about project management and pedagogy when you're talking about group projects in the classroom. We've discussed project management in the classroom as a student, but also as you teach, you might want to give your students group projects. And so thinking about how you would incorporate the teaching of project management alongside the technical skills that you want your students to work on for your project, that's also something that you can discuss with your students. You'll see in discussions such as this one from the Digital Pedagogy in the Humanities, Concepts, Models, and Experiments project, management is a reoccurring issue in any research project that is collaborative, which is many of them. Project management in the classroom, it still comes back to your goal or your learning objective in this case. So if you are having your students collaboratively work on a mapping project on your class roadmap, which is your syllabus, you have them learn the mapping skills, but you might also want to explicitly discuss collaborative group work skills. What do you expect them to learn in regards to mapping, but how do you expect them to approach this collaborative work? Sometimes you may experience a resistance to spending time on planning before beginning work on a project, but you will have to spend time planning at some point during your project, and working out how much you will have to spend, cost, or time on completing a project before starting will help you avoid magical thinking, which is sort of the irrational belief that things will just work out. So planning will help increase your ability to adapt to changing circumstances without being overwhelmed by failure.
Use Agile project management to fully integrate your cycles of planning. Do, check, act.
Thanks. If you have any questions, you will find additional resources and link on this guide, and you can contact us through email. Thank you.
Thanks.